Okay, so today what we're going to do is we're going to answer a question that I get asked often, which is when there are different customs and different ways of performing a mitzvah or observing a holiday or Shabbos or something like, which one is right? And how do we know if we're doing the right thing? Maybe we got it wrong.
Okay.
It's a question I get all the time. Who's the right one? What did God want? When He gave the Torah, what did He say? Is there a game of broken telephone where over 3,000 years God told us one thing and then we kind of got it wrong, or some people think it was that way and some people think it's this way, which would mean some person essentially got it wrong? That's the way a lot of people think about it. And we're here to address that and to explain why that's not the case. Why, even though there are divergent customs, they're all valid and they all come from God at Sinai. We need to explain how that is and how that works. Why is that? How does one verse have more than one meaning, both of which are correct? Verse says to observe Shabbos. Some communities observe this way and some communities observe that way. Well, who's doing it right? Which one did God have in mind? What did God tell Moses? That's the big question people ask often. And we're going to explain how that works and why it's like that. That's the objective today. Sound interesting enough?
But is it different customs because of different minhagim or?
Minhagim is just a Hebrew word for customs, but how did you get to that? And which one? Who's doing it right? Who's doing it wrong? Is somebody doing it right and wrong? And why are there different customs? Why aren't all Jews just doing it this way God told us to do it in the first place? Right? There are a number of different, glaring examples. The most obvious of them is tefillin.
Oh yeah.
Right? There are two different opinions, or four actually, but let's just say two, as to
Two pairs.
right to cover both opinions. Right? There's two opinions as to what the correct order of how you position the four different sections of tefillin inside the tefillin themselves. And according to each view, if you did the other view, you didn't fulfill the mitzvah. Now, both of these views are attributed to people in the post-Talmudic era, Rashi and his grandson, Rabbeinu Tam. So let's say those two views predate some time before. But when did the mix-up happen? Was there ever a time when all Jews were putting it in one way and at some point we got it wrong and now there are two opinions and we don't know which one's right? Which means if someone only follows one, that means they didn't do it? Like, how does this work? At what point in history did we have this divergent of opinions so vastly different? And how does this work? That's what we're going to be addressing today. Clear? Yeah? Okay. So let's begin at the top. This is an English little paper I put together with some sources. Obviously there's more elaborate sources, but we're sticking to the basic ideas. And the intricacies of each detail that I'm going to raise here is infinite, and there are literally books written on it, on each of these details here, but we're just sticking to the generalities, the overarching outline. So let's begin with this idea of two Torahs. So, as I write it here, when God descended on Mount Sinai and gave the Jewish people the gift of the Torah, He gave it in two parts. One, the written law, referred to the Torah, Tanakh, Bible, Pentateuch, different ways of referring to it, whose words were dictated by God to Moses. So that's the first thing. When we say Bible, when we say written Torah, when we say the text of the Torah itself, Chumash, we're referring to 5 books. Every single word in there is dictated to Moses by God. God says, take out a quill, take out parchment, and write down these words. That's literally what it says in the Torah. The Torah itself says, God tells Moshe, Va'ata, now write down these words. The details of this is itself, again, very elaborate. Did Moses write down the entirety at the end? Or as every time God communicated to him, he wrote it down each time? Discussions on that. There's discussions on the last text of the last few verses where it describes Moses' death. Who wrote that? Did he write it while he was crying before he died? Or did somebody else write it? Or did God give him the words and it was put later? All kinds of discussions. Yeah? You can say something? Oh, no, I thought you were going to say something. But overall, the general principle is that these are the words. The words themselves are chosen by God and given to Moshe. Now, along with that, we get a second Torah, what's referred to as to the oral law, or Torah Shebal Peh. The word Torah actually means law or instruction. So Torah Shebektav, the written law, the written Torah, or Torah Shebal Peh, the oral law or the oral Torah, through which one can extract the meaning of the written law and come to a proper understanding of God's will. We're going to elaborate on that in our discussion going forward. What this oral law is. Right? The oral law is transcribed in the Gemara and the Mishnah and the Talmud. That's where all the disputes are. So the disputes are in the oral law, which would lead one mistakenly to think that it's a case of broken telephone. God told Moses a bunch of things, and then we lost it over time, and someone's getting it wrong somewhere. But as we'll see, that's not the case. So then I write, although the Torah does not state clearly that anything else was transmitted other than the Torah itself, it does allude to it. So the Torah itself doesn't say, there's nowhere in the written text from the beginning to the end, right? The Torah Shebeksav, the written law. It doesn't say anywhere that God said anything else to Moses other than the words dictated there. However, there are some indications of it. And we're just citing on one, thank you. I'll just cite to one example. If you push the other door out, there you go. I just cite to one example when the Torah alludes to the fact that there was communication from God to Moses outside of the written text. It doesn't say so explicitly, which is in itself became a matter of contention. There were different groups who broke away from traditional Judaism by saying that anything outside the written text is not valid. They just completely negated the whole oral tradition completely. The Sadducees and the Karaites and those groups. The Dead Sea Scrolls you find in Israel, you heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls? Those are not from traditional Orthodox Jews. They're from a breakaway sect called the Essenes, which were even more like a breakaway of the Karaites, if you will. Essenes. Essenes, as they were called. I think that's what they were called. And they were a breakaway, if I'm not mistaken, of the Karaites. At any rate, they rejected the entirety of the oral law. They just written laws from God, everything else is man-made. But here's a verse which clearly indicates that there was more communication from God than just the text itself. The verse reads, Deuteronomy 12:21, and you shall slaughter of the herd of your flock, which God your Lord has given you, as I've commanded you. This is God saying, when you get into the land of Israel, you're going to have lots of cattle, and you're going to want to eat, so you're going to slaughter them and eat them. And the verse says, you'll slaughter them the way I told you to. Now, if you read the entire text from beginning to end, nowhere will you find that God tells Moses how to slaughter. And yet the verse says, slaughter it the way I told you to. Which would mean there's communication from God to Moses about how to slaughter an animal, and it's not in the text. Thus indicating there's more communication that was not meant to be written down. Clearly from the text. And this is from Rashi, the next text, who's citing from the Gemara. And the Talmud, which says, Lamadnu, that teaches that there's a commandment of how to do this ritual slaughtering known as shechita, which was given to Moshe at Sinai, even though it's not written in the text. So already here we're laying out the groundwork. Yeah?
I just want to know, like Rashi said this, let's say we don't know what shechita is. It could have been, his interpretation is this is what it was. And how do you know, like, it didn't mean, like, cut out the eyes of the animal?
Good question.
Make it kosher.
Good question. That becomes the subject of our discussion.
Right.
But meaning, how do we know that the tradition we have is the correct one? Right? Or how does it work is a better way of putting it. But what we do have from here, Rashi doesn't say how to do it yet. We're just indicating the fact that the written text itself tells us that there's communication outside the written text. That we can see clearly. So the written text, there are other indications. This is the most glaring one. The more obvious one, where God says, do something like I told you to, even though it's not written anywhere else, which means there must have been communication outside of just the written text. So now let's get into this. The nature of these two Torahs. Okay, so of the written law, Torah Shebektav, being that it was dictated by God, it's self-understood that no change could be made. The words are the words. These are the words God chose. Finished. Of the oral law, however, we have some peculiar statements, which means we have statements made in the Talmud about itself, which are like kind of strange. So the first one is, whatever novelty a diligent student will add in Torah was already given to Moses at Sinai. Where's the peculiarity here? What's the glaringly obvious question on this statement? Whatever novelty a diligent student will add in Torah was already given to Moses at Sinai. The obvious question is, if it's a novelty, how could it be given at Sinai? And if it was given at Sinai, how could it be a novelty? The Talmud is declaring that if I were to study Talmud, if I were to study the Torah, and I came up with some novel insight, that novel insight was already given to God at Moses at Sinai. So how does this work? Next statement. They are both the word of the living God. It's a reference to dispute. It's referring to, this is actually a passage in the Talmud, a very fascinating story where the famous disputants, the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, and the Talmud tells us, it's in Eruvin, if anyone wants to know, Eruvin 13b, where it says for 3 years, the houses of Shammai and Hillel were arguing. Shammai said the law follows us, Hillel said the law follows us. The houses of Hillel and Shammai themselves have passed, until they couldn't come to a consensus, and a heavenly voice came out and said, they are both the word of the living God, but the law should follow Hillel. So before the heavenly voice declares that the law should follow Hillel, the verse says, by the way, Shammai is also right. Wait, what? I thought they're wrong, and we're following Hillel. What do you mean they're both right? How does this work? Interestingly, the Talmud tells us why did the heavenly voice choose Hillel? 2 reasons. Number one, because they were more amenable, they were kinder people. And number 2, because they would study the words of Shammai before they would study their own words. Now, is that a reason to make the law like you? The law should follow the one who God decides. In other words, this story of Hillel and Shammai comes in the Talmudic era, 1,500, maybe 2,000 years after the giving of the Torah. The law should follow whatever God gave at Sinai. What does that have to do with being nice? If heavenly voice is coming out and declaring the law in favor of one opinion, then let the heavenly voice come out and settle all disputes. This is what I said at Sinai, that's not what I said at Sinai. This is what I said. Something's going on here that we're missing. What's the missing piece? And that becomes the next question. What did God transmit to Moses in the oral law? What did God say? And why isn't it clear? And if we forgot it, then someone got it wrong. And yet these statements seem to imply that they're both right, even though we're following the law of Hillel. Okay, so the next text comes from, as you can see at the end, Maimonides' Introduction to the Talmud. Maimonides, his first work in Torah, is a commentary on the Mishnah. It was written in Arabic because he wanted the masses of Jews to be able to understand it, most of whom were more literate, I guess, in Arabic than they were in traditional Hebrew, certainly than the complex works of the Talmud. And Maimonides, as is his custom throughout many of his works, wanted to simplify things that most people can learn, make Torah more accessible. So he took all the Talmudic back and forth and discussion on the Mishnah and simplified it to a running commentary on the Mishnah. So you can read the Mishnah and then read his commentary, and you'll get a simplified version of the Talmudic interpretations of the Mishnah. It's a very good work. It's still used till today. And then he writes an introduction to that commentary, which is kind of an introduction to all of Talmud. And there, he writes like this. So he describes the giving of the Torah at Sinai, and then he describes how Moses sat down with the elders to try to understand and decipher what the law is. And then he said like this: those ramifications which were not explicitly heard from the prophet Moses' lips, they, the elders, resolved through their understanding of the system of the 13 methods of Torah interpretation given on Mount Sinai. So what did God give at Sinai? A way to interpret. God did not tell us, here's the way you keep Shabbos. He said, here's the text, here's how you're going to interpret the verse. Go figure it out yourself. So long as you are using the rules of interpretation, so long as you are correctly using the words of the rules of interpretation, then what you're saying is correct.
So those methods of interpretation, does he
list them? They are listed in your siddur.
They are listed
in your siddur. Just before the morning service, just before the formal morning service, in the Chabad siddur, you'll have a passage there called Rabbi Shmuel Omer. That passage goes through 13 principles of how to interpret the Torah, and those 13 principles break down into hundreds.
So can we still do that now? The thing is, people are
good question. So we'll get to that. We will get to that. We'll get to that. And here comes the next line. But let's first understand this. Let's just get the principle straight. So getting back to the original question. If there are 2 periods of tefillin today with 2 different orders, and we ask the question, when in history did the split happen? It's quite likely right away. As soon as God gave the Torah, and in it said to put on tefillin and to write these 4 passages, it could be right then and there they started discussing and 2 conclusions came. Who was right? They were both right because you both used the rules of interpretation. But what should I do?
Did you put the 2 pairs on one arm or 1 pair after another?
Different opinion, different customs. I do one after the other. Some people do together. Yeah, but I do one after the other, as is Chabad custom. But others put 2 on at the same time. So let's see the next line here. When such a controversy would arise among the authorities, they would follow the majority of the opinion. As the Torah prescribes for such situations, you shall follow the majority. So let's understand how this works. If you have a group of 35 rabbis 3,000 years ago discussing how to put on tefillin, right? And it came down to, I don't know what number they give, let's just say it's 100, and it came down 51 to 49, then it would become law that this is the way you wear your tefillin. Which would mean, as soon as it becomes law for you to do it that way, the next generation can't argue with that anymore because the majority's already been reached. Now we can work with the majorities of the previous generation and start to build from there, right? But if no majority is reached, then you'll have persistent 2 customs, and that's what happened with Hillel and Shammai. 2 schools, both of which had used the rules of interpretation, both of which came to correct interpretations of the Torah, and they couldn't come to a majority consensus. And therefore, God intervention comes in. Look, you guys can't follow all the way through to find the majority. Here, I'm stepping in and tell you, follow Hillel because he's nicer. Was Shammai wrong? No, he wasn't wrong. It's just you guys couldn't get your consensus together.
Majority was, how does that work?
How does majority work? Okay, so in pre-Mishnaic era, well, that's not true actually. All the way through the Mishnaic era, and even the Talmudic era, there was a formal Sanhedrin, a formal high court, and they would vote. They would vote on issues. And they would enact laws. Because of that, there's a famous convention described in the Talmud where they enacted a bunch of laws, but that's what it is. They would convene and discuss. Now today it's a little more difficult because we don't have a center for convening. But what ends up happening is through what's called we have responsa nowadays, right? Which has been going on. Responsa. It's been going on since the post-Talmudic era, where basically if someone posed the question to me and I didn't know the answer, I would submit the question to a higher authority who might submit it to an even higher authority, and then they would write an essay, an in-depth scholarly essay explaining their conclusion, right? And let's say there's another scholar somewhere else who reads that and says, I disagree with it. So he'll write a responsa, disagreeing with it. And then a bunch of people will weigh in back and forth. And by the time the next generation comes around, they're not going to be considering the same issues that the previous generation considered. They'll be looking at all the conclusions and saying, look, we have more this way, more that way, less that way. If you open up, for example, Rabbi Yosef, the famous Sephardic chief rabbi of the last generation, you open up his scholarly works, he's renowned for brilliant memory and quoting from 1,000 sources. So you open up any response, a whole list. Question: 45 yes, 62 no, answer is no. He's like known for that kind of thing. So, but that's the way his conclusions come. I'll give you an example of recent times. There was a discussion in last, say, 100 years or so about using timers for electricity on Shabbos. And Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, if I'm not mistaken, who's a leading halachic authority of the last generation, in some ways the leader, he argued that it shouldn't be, if I remember correctly, it was him, who argued that no timer should be used on Shabbos. Why? Because if you have timers, then people will set timers to run their factories, and you'll have abolished the whole Shabbos.
No, I was told also that if you have timers, people walk by and assume that you turned on your light.
Okay, that's a different story. That gets into a complex issue when you apply that rule. But he was concerned that people would have their factories set on timers, and the whole Shabbos will have gone out the window.
But could they not have broken it up and saying, okay, forget the factory. I mean, if you have a timer, it's just so that your house is lit up or something. Can they not have that?
And that were the arguments. And the other scholars said, no, we'll put a limitation on factory timers,
Yeah.
but timers to get your lights on in your house or your heating, it's okay. So today, if you asked a rabbi if you can have a timer for your lights on Shabbos, even if he in theory were to agree with Rabbi Feinstein's arguments, he wouldn't tell you can't do it because a consensus has been reached.
The thing about electricity, that you also have to understand what electricity is. It's always there.
Oh, the halachic authorities get into the very, very details of how electricity works. They're engineers.
Right.
From some of the literature, you can see they understand it very well. For most notably, Rabbi Auerbach, Rabbi Stern, Rabbi Feinstein. You can read in their stuff; they understand how electricity operates in its very detail. Anyway, I learned how a fridge worked from reading Rabbi Feinstein, Rabbi Auerbach's responsa.
Okay.
That's how I learned how a fridge works.
How about using hot water on Shabbos or something? There's always
So that's a different story when you're using it for cooking versus when you're using just for lighting.
or for washing.
Yeah, that's all kinds of different stories. The point I'm making is that there's a consensus been made to allow it for lighting and for heating in your house.
But I was told that if you live in a building where you want to use the hot water and there is goyim in the building, you're allowed to use it because it wasn't.
Okay, it's a complicated issue. I don't want to get into the halachas of Shabbos now. I'm just making the point that the consensus and majority is still going on. It's still an ongoing conversation. There are still journals that publish Torah responsa, and over time, a consensus is reached. So it's not as formal as it used to be, where you had one body, a Sanhedrin, who sat down together to convene and vote, but these things happen through consensus, through responsa, and through Torah journals, and it's still an ongoing conversation until this very day to deal with new issues, especially in the medical field, in the technology sector, in different areas where till today it's still being discussed what and how to apply various different new technologies. So that's how that works. So to answer our questions, how is it that we have two different opinions and who's right? Answer, they're both right. Who do you follow? You got to follow the majority. Now the thing is, the most notable distinction was that once the Jews were in diaspora, especially after they left Babylonia, where they don't have the centralized body, different majorities emerged in different places. Most notably the Sephardi and Ashkenazi split, right? Where you had at least an extended period of time where you had scholars grouped in one area and scholars grouped in another area with not as much communication or consensus making between the two communities as you would have wanted. You end up having two sets of consensus, two sets of majority, and that's where you have the Sephardic custom versus the Ashkenazi custom. And then even within Ashkenaz, you have that town versus that town, you have that village versus that village, because of the lack of centrality in communication. Actually, one of the things that Maimonides wanted to do in his book of laws is he thought, okay, there's too much dispersion. I'm going to put it all into one place, and you don't have to consult any other books. Here it is, all conclusions at once. Wasn't successful in that endeavor, notwithstanding the fact that his work is still studied till today and is a very important work, but it didn't become the consensus closed case. He wanted it to be that way, but it didn't appear to be that way. The same thing is true of the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Laws. The very Code of Jewish Laws itself has super commentaries which sometimes disagree with the Code of Jewish Law. He wanted to bring it all together into one consensus place and open up a whole new discussion. So what ends up happening is every time you have one of these consensus, you have a generation or so that discusses it, consensus emerges around that, and you have to keep on building from that. So even if the Code of Jewish Law isn't accepted in every single one of its lines, it still remains the authority, because it's the consensus of that time and a little time afterwards with the commentaries on it, and so on and so forth throughout the generations. And it's still an ongoing thing today. Somewhat clear? Okay. Now let's get to the spiritual end of why. Yeah.
It's two different pairs?
Two different pairs.
Not the same pair that you put on twice.
No, two different pairs.
Two different pairs.
Yeah. Okay. So now the question becomes why? Why did God not state his desire clearly? Instead, leaving it to mortals to decipher, leaving much room for confusion. Why didn't God just make his own Code of Jewish Law? Instead of giving us a Torah with cryptic verses that require methods of interpretation and then consensus conversations and all the rest of it, just tell us what you want. Okay, as I said right here, the ultimate purpose of the Torah is that man, people, remaining the mortal that they are, connects to the Almighty. What better way than being part of creating divine will and wisdom? What I mean here is as follows. And this gets back to the statement made before, that whatever novelty a diligent student will add in Torah was already given to Moses at Sinai, which means, if I use the rules of Torah study, and I investigate some verses, and I investigate some Talmudic texts and some conclusions from previous generations, and I derive a new law to be applied to some situation. It's true, it's a novelty. So I was the first one to think of how to apply that law to this new thing. But of course it was still given at Sinai, because I only used the rules that were given at Sinai. Right?
Do you still have to get the consensus though?
I have to make my case.
Yeah, you have
I have to make my case
who do you make your case to?
in these Torah journals.
And then,
Today, in today's day, and people would argue or disagree, and over time, if someone were to adopt my case, if people were to start adopting my argument, then it would over time become consensus. I mean, I'm not on that level, but there are those who are on that level, and they're engaged in this conversation. I'm a passive reader of these conversations. I'm not so active in these things, but they exist. These conversations go on. People publish books, and then you counter books, and then journals, and things like that. But the point I'm making here is because the whole point is that God and man develop a relationship with. If we were to be told, if God were to say everything He wanted outright clearly, then we would be robotic respondents to God. But because the Torah is written in such a way where it allows for human ingenuity and innovation, what ends up being is a conversation, an ongoing conversation between God and man. The question of what does God want is not a closed book. It's still an ongoing conversation that we are to engage in. Right? Or to put it even more starkly, if a person came to 3 rabbis with a pot of soup and said a drop of milk fell into it, Rabbi number 1 says kosher, Rabbi number 2 says not kosher. Rabbi number 3 says either kosher, God wants you to make a blessing and eat it. He says not kosher, God says it's forbidden. Who created God's will? Human beings. So long as they did not veer from the system of Torah given by God, which is God's part of the conversation, and we use those rules to interpret it and apply it in a proper way, our part of the conversation, together, God and man in partnership, create Torah, create divine will. And thus, it's true, any novelty a diligent student will come up with was given to Torah at Sinai. A Jew can create Torah. So when it comes to the realm of halacha, it's much more difficult because the rules are much more black and white in terms of applying halacha and the requisite knowledge to know. But when you get to the world of homiletics or taking a verse and deriving a lesson from it, right? We're much more liberal in that. Anybody can read a verse and come up with some new insight on how to read it and how to apply it to their life in some lesson form. And that's Torah. That's Torah. As long as the lesson you're deriving is not violating some Torah precept, you've created Torah by using your own mind. It's an amazing thing. You've created divine wisdom.
But halacha is like, that's it, black and white?
The rules are much more black and white, yes.
But we've had the discussion on any of those?
The discussions are...
Even as we go into a more modern age and stuff, can there not be,
There are.
discussion?
I kept on saying there are discussions going on.
Right, so it's
But
not totally black and white.
the rules of the rules by which you make your argument are much more black and white. Right? In other words, a person, let's put it this way, when a person makes an argument in Torah for a certain case for a certain law, he's not saying, I think the law should be this because it's more convenient or because times have changed. That argument wouldn't even be considered. Would not have been considered, would not be published in a Torah journal. Wouldn't make it anywhere. What you'd have to argue is, there's a text here, there's a conclusion and precedent from that generation, and there's a counter conclusion from that generation, and putting these things together, it would seem to me that the correct way to apply the law is here. Not let's reimagine the law because times have changed. No. It's let's see how the law applies to the times that have changed. And that's the big distinction. That's the big distinction. We'll put it this way. When I talk about all this stuff, people ask, what's the difference between Orthodox and... If you're saying that Orthodoxy allows for rediscussing the law and trying to come to consensus, well then what's the difference between this and Reform? They've also come to the conclusion it's time to reform the law. Aren't you doing the same? The big distinction is as follows. The Torah, from this view, the Torah does not change. If the Torah changes, then it's no longer you partnering with God, it's you manipulating God's word and plagiarizing to fit your circumstance. The Torah remains as it is, and the rules are there, right? The question is, how do I apply those rules to the circumstance? That's very different than saying the circumstance requires us to re-envision the way halacha operates. That's not what we're doing here. Because that would mean I take the circumstance as true, God's word as iffy, and then I make a match. It's the reverse. God's words are true, the circumstance is iffy, and let's see what God's word, as it remains is, applies to the new circumstance. And that requires lots of ingenuity. It takes a lot of ingenuity and a lot of knowledge to understand the laws, understand the situation, and to apply the law without manipulating it. That's the big thing.
Were there any ever generations where they didn't have like scholarly rabbis to be able to?
That's a good question. Did there ever have a generation that didn't have scholar rabbis to do that? So in Maimonides' introduction to the Mishnah, he actually lists the names of people who led courts from the day of Moshe Rabbeinu till his day. And we can do it from his day to our day. You can literally trace person to person to person to person who taught you, who taught him, who taught him, who taught him, who taught him, all the way back to Moses without missing a day. Pretty incredible. And it's not like they're people, no-name people. We have quotes from them, we know where they lived, we have rough dates of their birth and death. It's pretty incredible. He does a list from Moses to the end of the Talmud, which is a little bit before him. Between him and the Talmud is not that long. You can put the dates. You can put the people. You can put the people there, and then from Maimonides to you can put the people. It's pretty incredible. Okay, so some of the next thing we actually covered, which is the aforementioned oral law was transmitted to Moses orally and was intended to remain so. Accordingly, only when generations passed and there were legitimate fear of the Torah would be forgotten did the sages decide to transmit the traditions to writing. These writings are known as the Talmud. So that's where the Talmud comes in. It's the Mishnah and the Talmud didn't invent those conversations. They didn't invent these laws. These were laws that were already existing. Every conversation and every law you have quoted in the Talmud existed for thousands of years before. It was only that when Jews were living in one location, specifically Israel, there was no fear of the tradition getting lost. Schools taught their students, and parents taught their children, and courthouses trained in the next generation of courthouses, and they had their conclusions from previous generations. In fact, sometimes the Mishnah will itself state, we have a conclusion from a generation called X, Y, and Z that says don't do this, and now we're working from it. Same thing in the Talmud. The Talmud will quote and say, we have a tradition from so-and-so who came to this conclusion, and therefore we're going to move forward from it. Right? It's only that when the destruction of the Second Temple happened during that era, and the Jews realized that this idea of living autonomously in one place where we can control the transmission of tradition is going to be over. And you have Jews all over the world, how are they supposed to keep the tradition going and how are they supposed to communicate if they don't write it down? And that was Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's big genius. It was very controversial at the time. Why are you writing down the oral tradition? The whole point is that it's supposed to be oral. Why are you writing it down? In fact, the oral tradition itself records that it's forbidden to write down the oral tradition. Forbidden. So why did he do it? Because he had no choice. He understood that this is the only way to keep it going. In fact, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's genius also is in the fact that the Mishnah itself is left without conclusions. You open up the Mishnah, it's supposed to be the consolidated oral tradition of what to do. Open the book, so-and-so says do this, so-and-so says do this, so-and-so says do this. Next law. What do I do? Doesn't say. Precisely for that reason. Because he's not interested in closing the conversation. He's interested in transcribing the conversation so that the next generation can continue to be part of the conversation. And that's true of all Torah literature. It's all an ongoing conversation. Provided that, again, you're following the rules of interpretation. And you're staying true to the divinely ordained rules, then it's all part of the ongoing conversation. So the Mishnah is written specifically without conclusions. For that reason. Here's how far the conversation has gone in my time. Now take it to the next generation. Talmud says the same thing. Here's how far the conversation has gone in our time. Now keep on going. And so on, and Shulchan Aruch, and the same thing, and so on and so forth.
When one refers to the Gemara, what are they referring to?
Okay, so the Talmud is comprised of two things.
Right,
Mishnah and Gemara. But usually people mean, when they say Talmud, they mean actually the Gemara.
They mean Gemara.
Usually when people say Talmud, they mean Gemara, even though truly Talmud is both Mishnah and Gemara. Mishnah is the original, concise, consolidated conversations written by Rabbi Hanassi. Commentary on that. But all the commentary is written in conversation form. All of it's written in conversation form.
So-and-so says this.
So-and-so says this, and he counted that, and he counted that, and sometimes no conclusion at the end.
Yes.
Right? But there are also rules to know how to understand the Gemara and the Mishnah itself. When Rabbi Yehuda Nasi put this person's name first, he put that person's name second, he's come to tell you that X. When he puts a statement without a name, he means to tell you this. And it's the Mishnah.
You have to read into what every commentator is.
That's correct. That's correct.
Really means behind that.
That's right. So when you're learning Mishnah and Talmud, there are two ways to learn Mishnah and Talmud. You can learn Mishnah and Talmud and never come to a halacha conclusion. And you're studying it just because you want to know and engage with God's Torah. And you're never going to come to a halacha conclusion because you're reading conclusions 2,500 years ago. Right? But then there is, you want to learn Jewish law, you'd be spending much more time reading books that were published in the last 50, 60 years. Right? You have to know Talmud to understand what they're writing, because they're going to be citing to Talmudic texts to say that's why I'm coming to my conclusion, and they're going to be citing to previous generations. But technically speaking, to come to your halacha conclusion, you're reading books from the last 100 years, let's say. Following? Okay. So as Maimonides describes in his introduction to the Talmud, and this is a quote from Maimonides, eventually came the time of Rabbeinu HaKadosh. His name was Yehuda. Rabbeinu HaKadosh means our holy rabbi. He compiled the laws, the words of the sages, and the disagreements that arose since the days of Moses until his own days. So it's not, there were conversations going on before, and he just compiled them and put them into a book so that it could be passed on to the next generation. As he writes, and he himself was one of the transmitters of the tradition. For he received it from his father, and then he goes in the whole list, back to the elders who received it from Joshua, he from Moses. So in those ... he puts every single name. The people were responsible from then till Moshe, and then he puts from Yehuda Nasi till the end of the Gemara, and then you can fill in the blanks from him. And then the last point, which is something I mentioned before, the sages of each generation treated the final words of the preceding ones as axiomatic. They would study them and derive details concerning them, but they would never differ from them. Because once a consensus is reached, Torah says follow the majority. A majority has been reached, Torah says follow that. And now you're building from the majorities of the previous generation, or precedent, if you will.
That's very much like the law. That's sort of
Sorry?
part of the actual law nowadays.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying Jewish law, I'm saying
civil law.
If you ever read something, it's always whereas this happened and that happened, and they have all these numbers and everything. They're sort of following the way
the big difference is that the judicial branch should be doing that. The difference is you have a legislative branch, right? So the legislative can actually go and amend laws. They can go back to the original primary rules and say we're scrapping that. In Parliament they can do that, or they can certainly add laws or whatnot. In Torah you can't do that. So the legislative and the judicial and Torah are combined because of that. Because yeah, that's right. So when people talk about, the rabbis are inventing the rabbis are bound by the law like anybody else is. And the laws would not be accepted unless they actually validated it by laws that they are bound by. It's not like a conspiracy. It's an open forum. Anybody with a valid enough opinion and a valid enough knowledge of the rules of interpretation that can counter some proposal today will be published and heard out in the public space. But the public space of those who can engage at that level of discourse, as opposed to it doesn't fit with our society. Right? You'd have to say it doesn't fit with that law. Meaning if someone wrote a paper and you found the passage in the Talmud that it contradicts, now you got a winning case. If you say it's too difficult and it doesn't make sense in today's society, it's not going to matter from a Torah journal perspective. Right? So in conclusion, the way in which we have different disputes is because what God gave to Moses is not the clear conclusion of every law, but rather the methods of interpretation. So long as you're using the methods of interpretation, then your view is valid. What we do in halacha, what we do in Jewish law, is we follow the majority. Once the majority is reached, the consensus is reached, the next generation builds their discourse upon those conclusions, and that's essentially what every single Jewish text is. Mishnah, Talmud, it's consolidated conclusions of previous generations, hoping the next generation can build off those conclusions. And why God did that is because this is the best way in which we can actually partner with God, not just in following what He tells us to do, but actually being part of the process of creating the Torah and creating the divine will itself. So I hope that answers some questions, if that was interesting. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.